There has not been a more important week of the fantasy season to go through top 12 defense rankings. This is the final battle for the fantasy football playoffs this year. So make sure to go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support, because I'm one of the only YouTubers going through defense rankings on a weekly basis. So getting into our first tier right here, I've got the Vikings defense versus the Atlanta Falcons here at number 1. Now, I had questions about last week's, obviously, putting the Packers at number 1 versus Dolphins. They ended up being a good fantasy defense, not the best. I would imagine I'm probably going to have similar questions to this week, right? Atlanta's coming to town. Kirk Cousins, it's a revenge game narrative, so why is it that the Vikings are here at number 1? Well, aside from the fact that the Vikings defense has been awesome this year, they're now the number 2 defense behind the Broncos, but that's not because they're all of a sudden bad. They're averaging 10.9 fantasy points per game. They've been ridiculously good. I have watched Kirk Cousins' film over the last couple of weeks, more specifically because I've been wanting to know what is going on in Atlanta. And I can honestly tell you this. There are 2 quarterbacks in particular that have taken a massive fall off this year. Aaron Rodgers, as we all know, and I'm telling you guys, Kirk Cousins has as well. Now, with Aaron Rodgers, his problem has been he has no more mobility anymore. He's completely shot as far as his mobility goes. He can still spin the ball really high level. Kirk Cousins is throwing up ducks, man. This guy is losing arm strength. It reminds me of some of his throws. Reminds me of watching Peyton Manning that last year with the Broncos. Honestly, like, he looks bad, and it's not just last week that he had 4 interceptions. He had 4 interceptions because there were horrific throws that he was throwing. So against a turnover-prone defense like the Minnesota Vikings and a defense that could get after the quarterback, yeah, I've got the Vikings here at number 1, and I've got the Steelers here at number 2 versus the Cleveland Browns. So obviously the first time they played the Browns, Steelers ended up losing that game, and they did not have a bad fantasy day, but it definitely was not one of their best. Like, their ceiling is definitely in the 15-point range, the 17-point range, depending on your format. And that's because of the fact that they create turnovers every single freaking week. They're either getting an interception or a couple forced fumbles recovered every single week. Now, what did I say heading into the week last week versus the Cleveland Browns when I put the Denver Broncos inside of the top 3? Because they can cause turnovers, and the Browns every week turn the ball over because Jameis Winston is turnover prone. Very fun to watch, and he's also really good, but he gave up 2 pick sixes and almost a third on Monday night to the Denver Broncos, and he put up 38 points, and they still were a great defensive play. That's because you want to play a defense that's playing Jameis Winston. And at number 3, I've got the Eagles defense versus the Carolina Panthers, and I'm not going to say this. It's not because the Panthers suck. They don't. Like, realistically, they've been playing really good teams, like top of the NFL teams the past several weeks. The Bucks, the Chiefs, like, they've just come out on the bottom because they're not as talented and not as good and haven't been building as culture as long. Now they get another bad break versus the Eagles, but it's not because the Panthers are playing bad. The Eagles are playing out of their minds good right now. Like, that defense is coming to life at the perfect time. Like, their rookies on the back end have just been clicking so much. And you've obviously got Vic Fangio at defensive coordinator pulling all the strings together. So with Vic Fangio and this Philadelphia Eagles defense, they're getting after the quarterback more efficiently over the past month. And they're also getting a couple turnovers per game as well. So I just think that Carolina just kind of got screwed a little bit this week, and that's what makes the Eagles a great defensive play. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, I've got the Cardinals and the Seahawks. They're playing each other, and it is in Arizona this week. Now, I think that both these defenses are actually really low-key good in fantasy. Like, the Seahawks, like, they've had a very streaky year. Their last 2 games, though, 20 points against Arizona the first time, and then they had 14 points against the New York Jets. They've had 2 straight weeks with a defensive touchdown. Now, that's a little bit harder to rely on, but when we're talking about a defense that has 4 touchdowns, which the Seahawks do this year, that's a little bit more than a coincidence. 4 defensive touchdowns is quite a lot. That's just ridiculous. Like, there's not many defenses outside of the Denver Broncos who are putting up that level of defensive touchdowns. That's a little bit more than a coincidence here. So even if the Cardinals end up winning this time, I think that the Seahawks would be a great play because, on the other hand, the Cardinals lost that first time, and they put up a great defensive performance against them as well. Their defense had 11 fantasy points the first time around against the Seahawks. Why is that? Well, because of the fact that the Seahawks turn the ball over at least once a game. Geno Smith is very turnover prone. The good thing about the Seahawks is that they're good for fantasy defense over the past 2 weeks particularly, but they're also good for other fantasy defenses because they turn the ball over because they are not a clean brand of football offensively. Geno Smith's making a lot of mistakes. This entire offense is making a lot of mistakes. You can also get after Geno through the pass rush. So I just think that with Arizona, regardless of whether they win or lose, I think these are both two great fantasy plays on the defensive side of the ball this week. And then at number 6, I've got the Chargers defense at Kansas City. Now, here's the thing. Again, I think the Chargers are going to lose this game. They've got a lot of injuries on their side of the ball, which actually I don't feel like the Chiefs are a bad defensive play too. Maybe you'll hear about them later on in the video. But the Chargers defense, last week they barely squeaked out a win against the Atlanta Falcons. And as I mentioned earlier, it's because of the fact that Kirk Cousins threw 4 interceptions. Now, ordinarily, I would say that's a fluke game, right? But there's 2 things going into effect of that. Number 1, I highlighted Kirk Cousins' demise that it's happening before our eyes. Number 2, the Chargers defense, if this was a coincidence, they wouldn't be a top 5 defense on the season. They're averaging 9 fantasy points per game for a freaking reason. Because they're good. They're a really good fantasy defense. They don't let opponents score many points. They get after your quarterback, and occasionally they have a streak where they get interceptions and turnovers. So against the Chiefs offense, who has not been particularly clean this year and not always putting up tons of points on the offensive side, I think the Chargers are actually a decent play this week, whether they win or lose. Dropping down to our next tier, the Buccaneers defense at number 7. They're taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, and that's the reason they're up here this high. Do not get excited. They had a really good opportunity, again, against the Carolina Panthers last week. And yes, I did highlight the fact that Carolina is definitely playing better football. But against a team that had been kind of, their offensive line is not good, and they've been turning the ball over so much. They only had 3 fantasy points to 5, depending on your format. Now, again, what keeps me roped in a little bit when it comes to the Bucs, and specifically with their schedule over the next several weeks, is the fact that the Bucs have been able to hit some big ceiling games this year. They hit one in week 4 against the Philadelphia Eagles. That was a good game. 11 to 13 points depending on your format. They also hit one in week 6 versus New Orleans. 17 to 19 fantasy points depending on your format. They did well against the Giants in week 12. So they can have these big performances because Todd Bowles is a defensive mind. They do get after your quarterback, and they occasionally do force a couple turnovers. And I just think that versus the Rams here, who have the worst turnover differential this year, I think that it's hard not to be inside the top 10 when you're playing them. Now going to the Bears defense at number 8. This one feels like a shot call for me personally. I am calling my shot on the Bears as a team in this week versus the San Francisco 49ers. Obviously, you can see the line on the screen according to Vegas. The 49ers are favored to win this game by a couple of points. Now, I don't think it matters. I think I'm going against the grain on this one and saying the Bears end up winning this game. There's several things at play. Number 1, the San Francisco 49ers, their season is from hell. I've been saying this all year. Now McCaffrey and Jordan Mason are both done. So they get Isaac Guerrero as their starter. He's not a bad player, but their offensive line is in shambles. Brock Purdy is back now, but he doesn't look good. The receivers are in shambles. That's their side of the ball, their problem. Now, the Bears just fired Shane Waldron a couple weeks ago offensively. Now they just fired Matt Eberflus, their coach. So typically what we've seen over the years is typically these teams who fire their coach, they get a nice season, they get a nice bump that same week they fired their coach. I think that's what I'm expecting here with the Bears. Now, the Bears have had their issues coming out of their bye week on defense and fantasy, so that's why I'm safeguarding myself down here a little bit. But just the way the 49ers are playing, they're just as big in shambles as the Bears are, and I like the Bears bump this week post Matt Eberflus. Dropping down to number 9. To round out this tier, the Bills defense at the Los Angeles Rams this week. I think the Bills defense has done really well. They're kind of the AFC's version of the Lions. They're steamrolling teams, and I don't see really what the obstacle is in front of them. The Rams offense can score points. That's why the Bills are down here lower. And it is also in Los Angeles this week. So the Bills' weather, that's not a factor. They can usually get a 5-point bump or a 5-point advantage because of the fact that their weather is so gruesome for all these West Coast teams that don't experience this type of weather. They're not getting that advantage this week. They're going to Los Angeles to play a team that is desperately fighting for their playoff lives. I expect the Bills to cede some points here, but I also expect them to get sacks because that's what they're able to get, especially with Von Miller back in the fold. I also expect them to get a turnover or two because the Bills defense ultimately has been doing that all year. That's why they're still inside the top 10, even against a stiffer opponent this week. And dropping down to our last tier right here, the Saints defense at number 10, and they're going to New York to take on the lowly Giants. This is a great matchup. There's no way around this one. I don't think there's a better matchup all week. I think I'm targeting teams specifically that are playing the New York Giants right now because they're an utter mess. But you know what the problem is with the Saints is that they haven't had a good fantasy week since September. Their defense has been pretty bad defensively in fantasy football since the month of September. So I just can't really trust their defense when they've been putting up performances 5 points to 8 points max. I mean, 9 points has basically been their ceiling since the month of September. So I want to rank them higher. I think they could be a really good play, but ultimately just what I've seen from them. They're not taking the ball away many times, and they are getting sacked, so I do believe they will sack Drew Lock 4 or 5 times. That keeps them inside the top 10, but ultimately, I just don't have tons of faith that there's some great play this week. The Titans defense at 11, they're taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars here. Now, again, great matchup here, and it probably is going to be Mac Jones again because Trevor Lawrence got brutalized by Azeez Al-Shaair. By the way, not a dirty play. I don't care what anybody says. But with the Jags, obviously, they're already a team that's in shambles, but they at least put up a fight with Trevor Lawrence. There will be no fight this week. It will be Mac Jones and that Pee-wee offense right there. The Titans defense, I've been saying all year, low-key good. NFL defense, not in fantasy. And that's a problem with the Titans defense because they're the number 27 defense in fantasy because they're not hitting big plays. But when I'm looking at this Jacksonville offense that can barely put up points with Mac Jones at quarterback, it doesn't really matter how many times they turn the ball over. If they don't put up more than 10 or 13 points, Titans defense will be a solid play this week. And to round it all out, I've got the Browns here at 12 against Pittsburgh, but I also wanted to highlight the Chiefs here really quick because I think they're in the same tier anyways for me in my rankings, and I just think that they both could have good games. The Browns obviously playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. First time they played them, they did pretty well. They caused a couple turnovers in that game, and the Browns defense is not particularly a prize in fantasy football. And I do think that the Steelers will end up winning this time around. So ultimately, I just don't have tons of confidence solidly saying they're my definite number 12. That's why the Chiefs are included this week because I do think they have just as equally of a shot as being a top 12 defense this week as well. They're taking on the Chargers. They're taking on the Chargers this week. It's in Kansas City. It is a primetime game. The Chargers are struggling with injuries to J.K. Dobbins, possibly even Ladd McConkey, their second best playmaker, being out. So what's the game plan here? The Chiefs could get after the quarterback, and they probably won't be able to move the ball very much if Ladd McConkey is also out. So I think the Chiefs actually might be a decent fantasy play this week, and in such an important week, I just wanted to throw in the 13th defense this week. And as I do at the end of every single week, I give you my favorite defense to pick up in advance for next week if you have the roster space to do so. And considering next week is going to be the start of most teams' playoff run, this is a very important pickup right here. And I believe you will see teams drop this particular defense this week because they play the Lions on Thursday night. But the following week, the Packers go to Seattle to take on the Seattle Seahawks on primetime. It's not that the Seahawks stink. They're a team that's number 1 in their division as of the time of this filming. But again, what I highlighted earlier with the Cardinals defense is they'll have a good day because Geno turns the ball over constantly. This offense has been playing anything but clean football all year, and the Packers are a very turnover-happy defense. So I believe this is going to be a great play, and it's a rare time to get a top 12 defense off the waivers because I believe teams will be dropping them this week since they're playing the Detroit Lions. So let me know how your lineup is starting to look this week, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receivers for this week, click on this video right here.